Chapter 3 of the Stormwater Management Guidebook covers the stormwater BMP specifications. In this video, we'll cover the 7 BMPs highlighted here. These BMPs are used to a lesser extent than some of the other BMPs that we've covered so far. The guidebook is arranged such that the specifications for each BMP type are laid out in the same format, and it includes the following subsections. Filtering systems, such as sand filters, are used in special situations where there's no retention value added by putting in this BMP, but they do provide that TSS removal function, that water quality treatment function, but without the retention value. So we don't see a lot of these, but they can be used in certain situations, particularly where there's that treatment requirement, such as in vehicular access areas. Infiltration is a BMP that takes advantage of good soils generally, because all of the water that's captured by them must be infiltrated within 72 hours. So you get 100% of the retention value for all of that storage volume, but you have to be able to have a good saturated hydraulic conductivity at the site to be able to really effectively use this BMP. Open channels are a BMP that we don't see a whole lot of, except for the dry swale, where the dry swale basically functions as sort of a linear bioretention. It achieves the same retention value as a standard bioretention design when the dry swale is designed with an underdrain, just as if it were a standard bioretention, but there are some additional considerations due to the linear nature of it and the conveyance of flow through and down the slope of the bioretention. It is also an accepted TSS removal practice. And then the wet swale and the grass channel, we see very few of. They take up space and don't receive a great deal of retention value. So they're not a high priority, and we don't see many of them designed and proposed. Same with stormwater ponds and stormwater wetlands in the tight urban environment of DC. They're rarely used, largely because of the low retention value, only 10% retention value for the storage provided, and they take up a lot of space. They are a TSS removal practice, so where possible, they could be a viable BMP, but we don't see this often. Storage practices. These are generally used for detention, right? They don't receive any retention value. They don't receive any TSS removal value. So the really only function is to detain large storm events. So we see these used when the BMPs that are cited are insufficient to provide enough storage to meet the detention requirements. When using these storage practices, you must provide the detention routing calculations to show that the design of these storage practices are contributing to the detention requirements, and you're meeting your requirements through those calculations. There are a number of proprietary practices out there. The approval depends on field studies or lab tests. There is a protocol in New Jersey, DEP protocol, that certifies. So if it's certified for New Jersey DEP, it's applicable to DC at the 80% TSS removal level. So we'll see these generally in those cases where there's a TSS removal, because most of them don't get much retention value. So the value here is in the high TSS removal and the generally, tight space that these can be fit in. So we'll see these in generally in the vehicular access areas. They're covered in Appendix T of the guidebook in more detail. Tree planting and preservation. This is actually a BMP that's very widespread. It's pretty easy to implement. There's not a whole lot to it. But what it essentially does is it gives retention value for individual trees, whether it's a new tree or an existing tree that's being preserved. there must be a landscape professional that provides an inventory for the existing trees if they're being preserved. And for new trees, there must be a planting plan prepared by a landscape professional showing what's proposed. Proper planting technique and maintenance is required. And one key thing about when preserving trees is the trees must be within the limits of disturbance, right? So if you have a site and there's a tree all the way on the other side of the property, nowhere near the other work that's being proposed, that tree is not eligible for preservation value, for retention value from the preservation. It must be within the work area, and it's encouraged to preserve trees that are existing because they produce great benefits in addition to just the stormwater value that they provide. But if there's a tree within the limits of disturbance of the project, you can preserve that tree and get the stormwater retention value for it. There are requirements on the rootable soil volume when planting a new tree. So if you can see here, the small trees, if it's just a single tree, it requires 600 cubic feet of rootable soil. If there are multiple trees sharing the same space, then each tree must have 400 cubic feet of shared space. For large trees, those numbers are 1,500 cubic feet for a single tree, 1,000 cubic feet for shared trees, for trees sharing the rootable soil. So soil is considered rootable up to a depth of 3 feet and within a radius of 16 feet for a small tree or 27 feet for a large tree. And so you can see here on this figure, there's a tree planted here, and this radius up to 16 or 27 feet, when not obstructed by pavement or a building or the property line, right? Soils off of the adjacent property are not eligible to be considered because that property could get developed in the future by a building being put up right up to this property line. So the rootable soil is this area in purple here within that radius and up to a 3-foot depth. So you can calculate the volume of that tree and to see if it meets the criteria for the large and small trees. The value in terms of the retention value is larger for preserved trees than for planted trees because they have the mature growth already, and it depends on the size of the tree. So for the small trees, less than 40-foot average mature spread, you get 10 cubic feet. For larger trees, you get 20 cubic feet. For trees that have already grown to a very large size, defined by DOT as a special tree or a heritage tree, you get the 30-foot cubic foot and the 40 cubic foot, and that's based on the circumference of the tree diameter at breast height. The planting trees, for a new small tree, you only get 5 cubic feet, and for a new large tree, you get 10 cubic feet, so half of what the value of a preserved tree is for those sizes.